They left behind towering citadels, gold-masked kings, and stories of warriors who seemed larger than life, but the truth buried beneath the ruins of Mycenaean Greece is far more unsettling than the legends. For more than 3,000 years, their palaces have stood silent, their tablets broken, and their weapons scattered across forgotten graves as if an entire civilization vanished in the middle of a breath. What we do know only deepens what we don't, because every excavation exposes another contradiction. Walls built to withstand armies, yet palaces that burned without a trace of battle. Tombs filled with weapons, yet no bodies scarred by war. A script so carefully crafted that it should reveal everything, yet instead reveals almost nothing. And the greatest mystery of all, how did the world of bronze armed warlords collapse so suddenly that even their memory was swallowed by the dark centuries that followed? Before we step deeper into these unanswered mysteries, take a moment to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter in our journey into forgotten worlds. The story of Mycenaean Greece begins with shadows, because even when we look directly at their past, it feels like we are staring through mist. Their citadels rise on high cliffs, surrounded by cyclopean stones so massive that later Greeks believed giants must have placed them there. But the people who lived inside these fortresses are far harder to see. What survives of their history is scattered across a handful of sites, a set of broken tablets, imported pottery found in distant lands, and the echoes of their memory preserved in later epics. Everything else is a puzzle missing half its pieces. Yet even these fragments draw us into a world that feels both familiar and alien. Familiar because their culture shaped the legends that form the backbone of Western storytelling. Alien because so much of that culture remains locked behind mysteries that refuse to open, no matter how often archaeologists return to the same ground. One of the earliest puzzles is how Mycenaean society grew into a network of powerful kingdoms without leaving behind any clear origin story. Their rise was quick, their influence strong, and their trade connections wide, yet the people themselves appear in the archaeological record almost without warning. Other ancient civilizations left detailed accounts of their beginnings, their rulers and their wars, but the Mycenaeans left only administrative lists. Not stories, not royal boasts, only inventories. For a civilization built on warfare, this silence feels deliberate, as if the most important events were never written down or were written on materials that could not survive fire and time. This gap in their identity is one reason they are so hard to define. Were they a unified culture or a cluster of rival warlords held together by fragile alliances? We don't know, because nothing in their surviving documents reveals their political emotions or their ambitions. Another mystery lies within their palaces, which appear more like administrative machines than royal homes. Their architecture is grand, but the layout of each palace follows a rigid logic. Storage rooms dominate large sections, holding jars big enough for several people to stand inside. Corridors twist around clusters of small rooms that seem designed for scribes, record keepers, or officials. Workspaces for artisans are tucked into outer courtyards, and the famous megaron, with its central hearth and painted walls, sits at the core like the heart of the entire system. Yet even here we find questions with no clear answer. These palaces seem designed for order, not luxury. They were centers of control, not open courts of celebration. So why do we not see stronger evidence of a central king in the artifacts? Why do we not find statues, inscriptions, or monuments praising rulers? Why does their bureaucracy look complete, yet their identity looks erased? Their art presents another layer of uncertainty. Mycenaean pottery appears across the Mediterranean, but the symbolism on many pieces cannot be clearly interpreted. Scenes on frescoes show warriors, hunters, chariots, and processions. But we don't know if these images represent real events, myths, or cultural ideals. They painted spirals, octopuses, shields, and abstract shapes, but without text that explain these symbols, the meaning remains elusive. Even their famous gold death masks raise questions. Are they portraits of real leaders or symbolic representations meant to elevate the dead into heroic status? There is no consistent standard, which suggests either that many workshops produced them or that each mask reflected personal or local traditions. We want to understand what these images say about their worldview, but without context, interpretation becomes guesswork. The Mycenaeans also mastered trade networks that stretched from Anatolia to the Levant and even into Egypt. Yet they did not record any treaties, trade agreements, or diplomatic letters. Other civilizations described Mycenaean visitors or enemies, but we have almost nothing written from the Mycenaean perspective. Why would a culture that managed vast economic systems avoid documenting anything beyond palace inventories? Some historians believe the answers were recorded on perishable materials, meaning their most important information vanished long before archaeology began. Others believe that Mycenaean writing was restricted to economic data, with all cultural memory preserved orally. This seems possible because later Greek epics reflect remnants of Mycenaean culture in their descriptions of armor, weapons, and social customs. But oral tradition cannot answer questions about real rulers, real battles, or real political struggles. When archaeologists study their weapons, confusion deepens. Mycenaean swords show advanced craftsmanship, and their armor was highly developed. Yet many warrior graves contain weapons that show little use. This raises the question, were these ceremonial items or tools of real conflict? If their society was built on warfare, where is the evidence of actual battles? Fortified walls suggest fear of attack. Weapons suggest a warrior elite. But skeletal remains do not show widespread combat injuries, and burned palaces do not always show signs of invasion. Some palaces fell in flames without any evidence of outside enemies, which suggests internal conflict or accidents. But if the destruction was internal, why did it occur almost everywhere at the same time? This sense of uncertainty defines every corner of their world. We know enough to see their power and sophistication, yet every detail that should provide clarity instead opens another question. Their citadels stand like monuments to an organized, disciplined society. But the lack of personal records makes them feel strangely anonymous, as if the people who built this world wanted to leave structures but not stories. And as we continue deeper into their world, the mysteries only multiply. The deeper we move into the world of Mycenaean Greece, the more we realize that their greatest mysteries hide not in their palaces, but in the people who lived behind those walls. Their society was built on hierarchy, yet the exact nature of that hierarchy keeps slipping through our hands. We know there were kings, officials, scribes, artisans, warriors, farmers, and enslaved workers, but the lines dividing them remain blurred. The tablets point to a structured administrative system, but the stories of individual lives are missing. This absence feels deliberate and makes us question whether the palace elite wanted to be remembered at all, or whether they believed their world would continue unchanged forever, making documentation unnecessary. Either way, what remains is a silent framework without the voices that once lived inside it. One figure who stands at the center of this silence is the Waynax, the Mycenaean king. His title appears in linear bead tablets, but his face, deeds, and legacy do not. Unlike Egyptian pharaohs or Mesopotamian rulers, the Waynax left no grand inscriptions, no statues carved in his likeness, and no monuments proclaiming victory. The palaces themselves may have served as symbols of authority, but their lack of personal signatures is puzzling. We cannot even say for certain whether the Waynax ruled with absolute power or shared authority with other high-ranking officials like the Lawajedas, a title that seems connected to military leadership. Were these figures rivals, partners, or representatives of separate branches of government? The tablets reveal their existence, but not their relationships. This missing context prevents us from understanding how decisions were made, how conflicts were resolved, or how authority was enforced across Mycenaean territories. Their warrior elite present another shadowed puzzle. Burials filled with swords, spears, daggers, and ornate armor suggest a culture that placed tremendous value on martial identity. Yet the physical evidence of large-scale warfare remains scarce. It is possible that much of Mycenaean conflict was small-scale, involving raids, skirmishes, or symbolic displays of military strength rather than lengthy battles. Another possibility is that their greatest wars were fought far from home, leaving no trace in domestic archaeology. The idea that Mycenaean warriors participated in long-distance campaigns or mercenary service is supported by foreign texts mentioning Aegean soldiers, But these records are brief and do not confirm whether such warriors were Mycenaean, Minoan, or other groups. Without clear evidence, we are left with images of warriors but no narrative to explain their purpose. Their weapons themselves deepen the confusion. The evolution of Mycenaean swords shows a shift from long, elegant bronze blades suited for thrusting to shorter, sturdier weapons designed for slashing. This transition suggests changes in battlefield tactics, but the lack of battlefield sites leaves us guessing what those changes meant. The famous boar's tusk helmets described in later Greek epics do appear in Mycenaean contexts, but we cannot confirm whether Homer's descriptions reflect real Mycenaean practices or poetic memory. Even the chariot, a symbol of elite power, remains an uncertain tool. Tablets record chariot parts, wheels, and horse rations, but they do not describe how chariots were used. Were they vehicles for war, prestige displays, or ceremonial processions? The images we have show chariots in hunting scenes or static poses, not in dynamic battle. Without more evidence, their true role remains unknown. Religion adds another layer to the mystery. The Mycenaeans inherited parts of their belief system from Minoan Crete, but they adapted it in ways we still cannot fully trace. Linear B tablets name several deities recognizable from later Greek mythology, including Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, and Artemis. But the roles of these gods may not have matched their later identities. In fact, Poseidon appears more frequently than any other god, suggesting he held a dominant position in the Mycenaean pantheon, possibly as a god of the earth or earthquakes rather than primarily the sea. Shrines within palaces reveal offerings, figurines, and ritual objects, yet very few clear depictions of myth survive. Unlike the Egyptians or Hittites, the Mycenaeans did not carve mythological scenes into their walls or write hymns on stone. Their religious life was active but not visually recorded, leaving us to interpret their beliefs through objects rather than stories. The role of women in Mycenaean society is equally enigmatic. The tablets list women working in textiles, religious roles, and palace service, but these records are administrative, not personal. Some women held high-status positions within cultic environments, suggesting influence that might parallel priestesses in Minoan culture. Yet the absence of narrative texts keeps us from understanding their authority. The art shows women in procession, in ritual poses, or engaged in daily activities, but these images lack the context needed to understand their significance. Did elite women hold political power? Did they lead ceremonies? Were they advisors to kings or custodians of tradition? The evidence hints at importance, but the silence of the written record holds back definitive conclusions. Even the Mycenaean economy, which appears well organized, contains contradictions. On the one hand, the palace system maintained control over grain, livestock, oil, textiles, and weapons production. On the other hand, many villages and smaller settlements show signs of economic independence. This suggests a dual system, palace-controlled industries alongside local activities outside the palace's reach. How these two systems interacted is unclear. Did the palaces enforce taxes or tributes? Did they negotiate agreements with local leaders? Or did they allow autonomy as long as essential goods flowed into palace storage rooms? Without contracts or political records, we cannot answer these questions. The system worked, but we do not know how. The spread of Mycenaean pottery, weapons, and artifacts across the Mediterranean shows far-reaching influence, yet the absence of letters or diplomatic texts creates a strange imbalance. We can see where Mycenaean goods traveled, but not why. Were they trading luxury items, exchanging gifts, paying for mercenary service, or establishing political alliances? The material evidence reveals connections, but the cultural intent behind these connections remains hidden. All these mysteries grow heavier when we remember that this civilization eventually collapsed. Their palaces burned, their writing disappeared, and entire regions emptied. But before we confront the collapse itself, we must examine the final layer of their world, the one that contains their most haunting questions. The final chapter of the Mycenaean story forces us to confront the mystery that overshadows everything else, their sudden and devastating collapse. Around 1200 BCE, a wave of destruction swept across the eastern Mediterranean, striking powerful civilizations with brutal efficiency. The Hittite Empire fell. Trade routes broke. Cities from Anatolia to the Levant burned. In this darkness, the Mycenaean world also vanished. But their disappearance remains one of the most debated events in ancient history. Their palaces were destroyed within a few decades of each other. Their writing systems ceased to exist, their workshops fell silent, and the population of Greece sharply declined. A culture that had dominated mainland Greece for centuries simply dissolved. Yet the clues they left behind refused to point clearly in any one direction, creating a cloud of overlapping theories that deepen the mystery rather than solve it. One explanation suggests intense internal conflict. Some palaces show signs of fire without evidence of foreign invasion, hinting at uprisings or rivalries. If Mycenaean society depended heavily on hierarchical control, the weakening of central authority may have ignited power struggles. The palace system may have stretched resources to a breaking point, leaving local leaders eager to challenge traditional authority. But if internal conflict brought down one kingdom, why did almost all major centers collapse around the same time? That level of coordination seems unlikely without a larger external force acting simultaneously. The pattern feels too widespread to be explained solely by civil unrest. Another theory points to invasions, particularly the mysterious sea peoples. Egyptian records mention groups of raiders attacking across the Mediterranean around the same era. These groups are blamed for destroying cities, disrupting trade, and destabilizing entire kingdoms. It is possible that some of these groups targeted Mycenaean territories, contributing to the destruction of palaces. But this explanation also leaves gaps. No clear archaeological evidence shows large invading armies moving across mainland Greece. The destruction layers differ from site to site. Some palaces burned from within. Others show signs of abandonment before any fire occurred. If invaders played a role, their presence remains invisible, their weapons undiscovered, and their path undefined. Environmental pressures could also have played a significant part. Studies suggest that the late Bronze Age faced periods of drought, reduced rainfall, and agricultural decline. If crops failed and food shortages spread, the palace system dependent on redistributing resources might have collapsed under its own weight. Famine could have weakened populations, triggered migrations, or sparked internal rebellions. But environmental stress alone cannot explain the destruction of palaces, nor the disappearance of writing. Civilizations often adapt to gradual climate change rather than collapse entirely. Something more direct must have pressured Mycenaean society beyond recovery. Earthquakes present another plausible factor. Greece sits on a seismically active region, and some destruction layers show patterns consistent with quake damage. However, earthquakes alone do not burn palaces, nor do they explain the abandonment of writing or the disappearance of entire communities. Natural disasters may have contributed to instability, but they cannot fully account for the scale of the collapse. A more complex theory combines multiple causes. Climate stress weakened agriculture, trade disruptions fragmented the economy, internal rivalries grew, and outside attackers sensed weakness. This cascading collapse model suggests that no single cause destroyed Mycenaean Greece, but a chain of events unraveled the entire system. The palace networks depended on delicate balances, economic, political, and social. When those balances broke, the collapse accelerated. Yet even this combined explanation is not fully satisfying, because it still does not clarify why a civilization that adapted for centuries suddenly failed to recover. The disappearance of linear B writing is one of the most striking signs of collapse. For a system that managed every aspect of palace life, its abrupt end is startling. There is no slow reduction of records, no transitional script, no sign of literacy surviving in smaller communities. It simply stops. This suggests that the scribes who maintained the system either died, fled, or lost their roles when the palaces fell. Because writing served administrative rather than cultural purposes, it may have held no value outside palace walls. When the system collapsed, so did the need for writing. But this raises a larger question. How did an entire society continue without preserving its most important information? The loss of writing pushed Greece into centuries of obscurity known as the Dark Age, where archaeology becomes sparse and cultural memory fades. The collapse also changed the landscape of Greece. Many settlements vanished or shrank. Populations moved to defensible locations. Trade networks contracted. Pottery styles changed. Social organization became simpler, with local chiefs replacing palatial kings. What is remarkable is not only that the Mycenaean world fell, but that it was never rebuilt. Other civilizations recovered after collapse, but Greece did not return to a palatial system. Instead, it evolved into a new world that would eventually give rise to classical Greek culture. This transformation feels intentional, as if the memory of the old world was either rejected or forgotten entirely. The absence of tombs from the early stages after the collapse adds another question. Mycenaean elites once built monumental graves, filled with gold and weapons. After the collapse, burials became simpler and fewer. This shift may reflect economic hardship, but it may also signal a cultural break from the past. If the old elite disappeared, who replaced them? And why did the new leaders abandon traditions that had endured for centuries? Trade connections also changed drastically. The widespread distribution of Mycenaean pottery halted. Imports from abroad dropped. Greece became isolated. This suggests either a loss of maritime skill or the collapse of demand for foreign goods. If the Mycenaeans had been major players in Bronze Age trade, their disappearance would have created power vacuums elsewhere. This possibility strengthens the idea that the Mycenaeans were not passive victims, but part of a larger region-wide crisis. The most unsettling part of this entire collapse is that the Mycenaeans left no explanation for their downfall. No final inscriptions, no warnings, no stories of war or famine. Their voices disappear exactly when we need them most. Later Greek myths reference ancient kings and heroic warriors, but these stories are poetic echoes, not historical testimony. They cannot tell us what caused the palace fires or why the writing stopped. They carry only fragments of memory, shaped by centuries of storytelling. In the end, what remains is a silence so complete that it feels almost intentional. The Mycenaeans built fortresses, wrote records, fought battles, traded across seas, and shaped legends, yet they left almost no personal trace of who they were or how they lived. Their world rose quickly and fell even faster, swallowed by forces still debated today. And the unanswered questions they left behind continue to challenge every new discovery. Because each explanation reveals another gap, another contradiction, another piece missing from the puzzle, the ruins of Mycenaean Greece stand like unanswered questions carved into stone, reminding us that even the strongest civilizations can vanish without revealing their final secret. And somewhere beneath the ashes of their palaces, a truth still waits, daring us to uncover the next mystery that time has refused to surrender.